I should have spoken. That is the thought that wakes me now every morning before dawn, in this cramped boarding house in Philadelphia, where I've come to hide from nothing and everything. I should have spoken. 3 words so simple, but I did not. And now I am haunted not by what I did, but by what I understood and chose to bury beneath layers of cowardice and complicity that have calcified around my heart like scar tissue. My name is Edward Finch. I was 23 years old when I accepted the position as tutor to the Pembroke family of Fair Haven Plantation, Virginia in the spring of 1857. I came from Boston, from a world of cobblestones and lecture halls, of abolitionist pamphlets passed in secret and debates conducted in hushed parlors over weak tea, and strong convictions. I considered myself enlightened. I considered myself moral. I had attended lectures by Frederick Douglass. I had read Uncle Tom's Cabin and wept at the appropriate passages. I had signed petitions and nodded gravely when my professors spoke of the peculiar institution as a stain upon our national character. But I needed the money. My father had died the previous winter, leaving debts that consumed what little inheritance might have come to me. My mother and 2 younger sisters depended on my income. The position at Fair Haven paid 3 times what I could earn at any school in Boston, and so I told myself that teaching a child his Latin declinians was not the same as wielding a whip. I told myself that I could remain untainted, that I could observe without participating, that I could maintain my moral superiority while accepting the wages of sin. I told myself many things in those days. I have spent the last 20 years learning how every single one of them was a lie. The journey south was my first education in self-deception. I took the train from Boston on a bright April morning, my trunk packed with books and clean shirts and the certainty of my own righteousness. As we traveled, the landscape changed with a subtlety that was almost imperceptible at first. The neat stone walls of New England gave way to wooden fences, then to no fences at all. The compact farms of Pennsylvania, where a man might work his own land with his own hands, stretched and expanded into something else entirely. By the time we crossed into Virginia, the world had transformed. Fields stretched to the horizon, vast and green and terrible in their beauty. Cotton and tobacco grew in rows so straight they seemed to vanish into infinity. And moving through those fields, small and dark and distant, were the people who made that impossible geometry real. I looked at them through the train window, as one might observe cattle or birds or any other feature of the landscape. I am ashamed to write this, but it is true. They were part of the scenery to me, no more remarkable than the trees, no more human than the mules that pulled their plows. I remember thinking how peaceful it all looked, how pastoral, how different from the soot and noise of Boston's factories, where white men worked themselves to death for pennies. I remember thinking that perhaps the Southern planters had a point, that perhaps there was a natural order to things that Northern idealists simply could not understand from their comfortable distance. I remember being a fool. The train deposited me at a small station 20 mi from Fair Haven. Master Pembroke had sent a carriage driven by an elderly slave whose name I did not think to ask. We rode in silence through the spring afternoon, the air thick with humidity and the scent of growing things. I watched the countryside roll past and felt a growing unease that I could not name. Everything was too green, too lush, too alive. It felt like the land itself was gorging on something, feeding on some invisible sustenance that made it swell with obscene fertility. We passed other plantations, other great houses set back from the road like monuments to prosperity. We passed slave quarters, long rows of rough cabins that looked more like animal pens than human dwellings. We passed fields where men and women worked in lines, their movements synchronized in a way that seemed almost mechanical, as if they were parts of some vast machine rather than individual human beings. And everywhere, overseeing it all, were white men on horseback carrying whips. I looked away. I told myself it was not my concern. I told myself I was just a tutor, just a teacher, just a man trying to earn an honest wage in a dishonest world. I told myself that I could remain separate, untouched, clean. I was wrong about that, too. Was fair haven, was everything the Pembrokes had promised in their letters, and more than I had imagined in my naive, northern ignorance. The main house rose like a temple at the end of a long avenue of oaks, their branches meeting overhead to form a tunnel of green shadow. The house itself was white-columned and gracious, 3 stories of elegant proportions and classical detail, surrounded by gardens that perfumed the air with honeysuckle and jasmine and roses the size of teacups. There were fountains and marble statuary and carefully manicured lawns that seemed to glow in the late afternoon sun. It was beautiful. It was monstrous. It was both things at once, and I lacked the wisdom to see the contradiction. Master Thomas Pembroke met me on the portico, a man of perhaps 50 years, broad-shouldered and red-faced, with the easy confidence of someone who had never been contradicted by anyone who mattered. He had thick hands and a booming voice, and a laugh that seemed to come from deep in his belly. He welcomed me with the hearty warmth of a man greeting a favored nephew, clapping me on the shoulder hard enough to make me stagger. "Mr. Finch, welcome. Welcome to Fair Haven. I trust your journey was not too arduous. The trains are improving every year, are they not? Soon we shall be able to travel from Boston to Richmond in a single day. What a world we live in, sir. What a world." He ushered me inside with a proprietary pride, pointing out features of the house as we walked. The imported wallpaper from France, the chandelier from Venice, the furniture crafted by the finest cabinet makers in Charleston. Everything was the finest, the best, the most expensive. Everything was designed to impress, to overwhelm, to establish beyond question the wealth and taste and power of the Pembroke family. And everywhere, moving silently through the rooms like shadows, were the slaves who made it all possible. They brought refreshments. They carried luggage. They opened doors and pulled out chairs and anticipated needs before they were spoken. And Master Pembroke moved through them as if they were furniture, noticing them only when they failed to perform their functions with sufficient speed or grace. His wife, Catherine, was a pale wraith of a woman who seemed to drift rather than walk, her movements languid and dreamlike. She smiled when introduced to me, but it was a smile without warmth, the kind of expression one might wear to a tedious social obligation. She spoke in whispers, as if the effort of normal conversation was beyond her strength. I learned later that she took laudanum for her nerves, that she spent most of her days in a drugged haze, floating through her life like a ghost haunting her own house. Their son Thomas Jenner was 12 years old, spoiled and sullen, amusing with his father's arrogance, but none of his charm. He looked at me with open contempt when we were introduced, clearly resenting the imposition of formal education on his comfortable existence. He had been raised to believe himself superior to everyone around him by virtue of his birth, and the arrival of a tutor from Boston to correct his grammar and teach him dead languages was an insult to his dignity. Their daughter Elizabeth was 18, considered a beauty by local standards, with her mother's pale skin and delicate features. But there was something brittle about her, something fragile and desperate in the way she smiled. She was of marriageable age, and I would learn that her father had been negotiating her future, as one might negotiate the sale of a prize horse, seeking the best possible alliance to secure Fair Haven's prosperity for another generation. I was given a room on the second floor of the main house, a luxury that surprised me. Most tutors, I learned, were housed above the stables or in converted storage rooms. But Master Pembroke wanted me close, wanted his son to absorb learning as one absorbs the air through constant proximity to an educated man. My room was spacious and well appointed with a large window overlooking the gardens and a writing desk of polished mahogany. I had my own wash, my own wardrobe, my own small library of books. I had everything except an excuse. That first night, I lay in my comfortable bed in my comfortable room and listened to the sounds of the plantation settling into darkness. I heard the bell that marked the end of the workday. I heard the slaves returning from the fields, their voices carrying across the distance, singing songs I did not understand in rhythms that seemed to come from somewhere older than America. I heard the overseer's final rounds, his boots on gravel, his voice calling out orders for the morning. And I heard, though I tried not to, the sound of a whip and a cry of pain from somewhere in the darkness. I pulled my pillow over my head and told myself it was not my concern. I told myself I was just a tutor. I told myself I was just there to teach Latin and mathematics and history. I told myself I could remain separate, but separation, I would learn, is its own form of complicity. The plantation ran on a schedule as precise as any factory I had seen in Boston. The bell rang at 4:30 in the morning, waking the field hands before dawn. By the time the sun rose, they were already at work, moving through the rows of cotton and tobacco in lines that stretched across the horizon. The house slaves rose earlier, still preparing breakfast for the family, lighting fires, carrying water, performing the 1,000 small tasks that made the Pembrokes' comfortable life possible. I began my duties with young Thomas at 8:00 each morning. We worked in the library, a room lined with books that no one in the family had ever read, purchased by the yard to give the impression of learning. The boy was a poor student, lazy and resentful, more interested in tormenting the house servants than in conjugating verbs. He would accidentally spill his ink on the floor and ring for a slave to clean it. He would demand water, then complain it was too warm or too cold, and send it back. He would ask questions not out of curiosity, but to waste time to delay the moment when he would have to apply himself to actual work. I corrected his Latin and said nothing about his cruelty. I was a coward. I have always been a coward. It was during those first weeks that I began to notice the rhythms of the household, the invisible choreography that kept everything running smoothly. And at the center of that choreography was Sarah. I noticed her on my 3rd day at Fairhaven. She was the head cook, a woman of perhaps 30 years, though it was hard to tell. The sun and labor aged people differently here, marking them in ways that had nothing to do with time. She was tall, taller than most of the women I had known in Boston, with a straight back and shoulders that spoke of strength rather than submission. Her hands were large and capable, scarred from years of kitchen work, moving with a precision that was almost hypnotic to watch. She had a scar that ran from her left eyebrow to her hairline, a pale line against her dark skin that caught the light when she turned her head. I never learned how she got it. There were many things I never learned, many questions I never had the courage to ask. What struck me first was her silence. The kitchen was her domain, a separate building connected to the main house by a covered walkway, and she ruled it with gestures and glances rather than words. The other house servants moved around her like planets around the sun, anticipating her needs, responding to the slightest tilt of her head or movement of her hand. She rarely spoke, and when she did, her voice was low and measured, each word carefully chosen and precisely deployed. She was illiterate, I learned, from the other servants. She had been born on the plantation, had never left its boundaries, had never been taught to read or write. Master Pembroke considered education for slaves to be not only unnecessary, but dangerous, likely to give them ideas above their station. And yet there was something in Sarah's eyes when she looked at you, a quality of attention that was unsettling in its intensity. She saw things, she noticed things, she understood things that no one had ever taught her. I began to notice things too. It started small, with observations so minor. I almost dismissed them. I would see Sarah standing in the kitchen garden in the early morning, perfectly still, watching the bees move from flower to flower. She would stand there for 10, 15, 20 minutes, utterly absorbed, her attention focused, with a concentration I had rarely seen even in the scholars at Harvard. Then she would return to her work without comment, as if this observation was simply part of her routine. A week later, Master Pembroke would be at dinner, complaining that the cotton in the east field was showing signs of blue weevil, just as Sarah had quietly mentioned to the overseer days before. But her warning had been dismissed. She was just a cook after all. What could she possibly know about agriculture? What could an illiterate slave woman understand about the complex science of farming? Everything. As it turned out, she understood everything. I began to watch her the way she watched the bees. I told myself it was curiosity, the natural interest of an educated man in an unusual specimen. I told myself I was observing her the way a naturalist might observe an interesting animal, cataloging behaviors and patterns with scientific detachment. But it was more than that. It was fascination. It was the first crack in my carefully constructed worldview, the first hint that everything I thought I knew about intelligence and education and human worth might be built on foundations of sand. Sarah could not read, but she read the world with a precision that shamed my book learning. She would listen to Master Pembroke's cough at breakfast, her head tilted slightly as she poured his coffee, and predict with uncanny accuracy when his gout would flare. She would observe the color of the sky at dawn, the direction of the wind, the behavior of birds and insects, and know whether to prepare the root cellar for storm. She would watch the way the overseer walked, the set of his shoulders, the rhythm of his steps, and know before anyone else that he had been drinking and would be cruel that day. And I saw her warn the other slaves with nothing more than a glance, a slight movement of her eyes, a barely perceptible nod, and they would respond, making themselves scarce, finding urgent tasks that took them far from the overseer's path. She had created within the brutal machinery of the plantation a small pocket of safety through nothing more than observation and intelligence, that the network of silent communication that the white inhabitants of Fair Haven never even suspected existed. I saw all of this, and I said nothing. The summer heat came like a weight, pressing down on everything, turning the air thick and hard to breathe. The slaves worked through it, their clothes soaked with sweat, their movements slower but never stopping. The Pembrokes retreated to the coolest rooms of the house, where slaves fanned them with palm fronds and brought them cool drinks and complained about the weather, as if it were a personal affront, rather than a natural phenomenon. Young Thomas became even more insufferable in the heat, his lessons deteriorating into sullen silence or outright rebellion. He would claim headaches or stomach ailments, anything to avoid work. And when forced to study, he would take out his frustrations on the house servants, finding new and creative ways to make their lives miserable. I watched him order a young girl, perhaps 14 years old, to fetch him water from the well rather than the kitchen, simply because the well was farther away, and the day was hot. I watched him accidentally knock a tray of dishes from an elderly man's hands, and then berate him for clumsiness. I watched him pull the hair of a child who was sweeping the hallway, laughing when she cried, and I said nothing. I corrected his Latin and taught him about the Punic Wars and said nothing about the war he was waging against people who could not fight back. I was complicit. I was always complicit. It was in late July that I began to see the pattern, though I did not recognize it as such at first. The incident seemed unconnected, random misfortunes of the kind that plague any large enterprise. But looking back now, with the clarity that comes from distance and guilt, I can see how each piece fit into a larger design. How each accident was not an accident at all, but a carefully orchestrated move in a game I was too blind to recognize. The first incident seemed like simple bad luck. Master Pembroke had arranged to sell a portion of his cotton crop early, before the market was flooded with the fall harvest, to a merchant in Richmond. It was a clever move, one that would have brought a substantial profit and helped offset some of the debts that Pembroke had accumulated through his lavish lifestyle and poor business decisions. The merchant was to arrive on a Thursday to inspect the cotton and finalize the deal. On Wednesday night, a summer storm rolled in from the east. It came suddenly with little warning, the sky turning black and the wind rising to a howl. Rain fell in sheets, turning the roads to rivers of mud. The storm lasted through the night and into the next morning. And when it finally cleared, the main road to Fairhaven was impossible. The bridge over the creek had been washed out, and the approach to the plantation was a quagmire that no carriage could navigate. The merchant sent word that he could not make the journey and had purchased his cotton elsewhere. The opportunity was lost. Master Pembroke raged for days, cursing the weather and his bad luck and the incompetence of everyone around him. But it was an act of God. Everyone agreed. What could be done against the forces of nature? I was in the kitchen 3 days later, fetching a book I had left there, when I overheard Sarah speaking to one of the house girls. Her voice was so low, I almost missed it, barely more than a whisper. But in the quiet of the afternoon, it carried clearly. The clouds were red at morning, she said, her hands busy with some task I could not see. The wind came from the east. The birds were flying low. I knew it would rain hard. She paused, and I held my breath frozen in the doorway. I told Master Pembroke he should send word to the merchant to come a day early, but he did not listen. He never listens. My heart began to pound. Had she told him? I tried to remember, and then I did remember. I had been present at breakfast 3 days before the storm, sitting quietly at the end of the table, while Master Pembroke held forth on his business acumen. Sarah had been serving the coffee, moving silently around the table, and she had said something so quietly it was almost inaudible, about the weather turning. Master Pembroke had waved her away without looking up, irritated at the interruption. "I don't need a slave to tell me about the weather," he had said. "I have eyes in my head." She had warned him. She had given him the information he needed to avoid disaster. And he had ignored her, because she was a slave, because she was a woman, because she was beneath his notice, and the opportunity had been lost. I backed away from the kitchen door, my mind reeling. It was a coincidence, surely. She could not have known the storm would be that severe. She could not have predicted that the bridge would wash out. It was just bad luck, just chance, but a seed of doubt had been planted, and it would grow in the darkness of my silence until it consumed everything. The second incident came in early September, when the heat had finally broken, and the air carried the first hints of autumn. Master Pembroke had been negotiating the purchase of a neighboring property, a smaller plantation called Oakwood, that had fallen on hard times after its owner died and left it to a son who had no interest in farming. It was a good price. Everyone said the land was fertile, the building sound, and the purchase would expand fair. Havens holdings significantly, increasing Pembroke's status and influence in the county. The papers were to be signed on a Tuesday. The lawyer was coming from Richmond, and Master Pembroke had invited several neighboring planters to witness the transaction and celebrate his success. It was to be a grand occasion, a demonstration of Pembroke's business acumen and growing power. On Monday evening, Master Pembroke fell ill. A clear throat. It came on suddenly during dinner, a violent stomach ailment that left him weak and feverish and unable to leave his bed. The doctor was summoned from town, a journey of several hours. He arrived near midnight, examined the patient, and prescribed rest and bland foods and time. The signing was postponed. The lawyer returned to Richmond. The neighboring planters went home, and by the time Master Pembroke recovered a week later, another buyer had swooped in and purchased Oakwood for cash, a quick transaction that left no room for negotiation or delay. Master Pembroke was devastated. The opportunity had been perfect, and it had slipped through his fingers because of an inexplicable illness that had come and gone like a ghost. He raged against his bad luck, against the doctor's incompetence, against the universe itself for conspiring against him. I was bringing young Thomas his afternoon lessons when I passed the kitchen. The door was open to catch the breeze, and I could see Sarah inside preparing something at the large wooden table that dominated the room. The overseer's wife was there, a pinch-faced woman named Mrs. Crawford, who suffered from chronic headaches and consulted Sarah regularly for remedies. "You have a gift, Mrs. Crawford was saying, her voice filled with admiration. "You always know just what will help. That tea you made me last week cured my headache completely." Sarah's face was impassive as she worked, grinding something in a mortar with steady, rhythmic movements. "I only know what I have seen work before," she said quietly. "My mother taught me about herbs and her mother before her." "Well, it's a blessing," Mrs. Crawford said. "I don't know what I would do without your remedies." Sarah nodded, accepting the compliment without comment, but her eyes for just a moment flicked toward the pantry, where the master's food was prepared. And something in that glance made my blood run cold. It could not be. It was impossible. Sarah had no reason to sabotage her master. She would be punished, perhaps killed if she were discovered. The risk was too great. And yet I could not shake the image of that glance, so brief it might have been imagined, so loaded with meaning it could not be ignored. I began to watch more carefully. I began to see the way she listened at doors, positioning herself to overhear conversations while appearing to be engaged in some innocent task. I began to notice how she asked questions of the overseer, of the master's business associates when they visited. Questions that seemed like simple curiosity or the natural interest of someone trying to do her job. But that extracted precise pieces of information about crops and markets and business dealings. She was gathering intelligence, and she was using it. But to what end? What could a slave possibly gain from sabotaging her master's business? If Fairhaven failed, she would simply be sold to another plantation, perhaps to a cruel master, perhaps to a fate worse than the one she currently endured. It made no sense, unless the goal was not personal gain, but something else entirely. Unless the goal was simply to resist, to fight back in the only way available to someone who had no legal rights, no physical power, no voice that anyone would hear. Unless the goal was to prove, if only to herself, that she was not powerless, that she could affect the world around her, that she mattered. I began to understand dimly what I was witnessing, and I began to be afraid. The third incident was the most devastating, And it was the one that finally opened my eyes to the full scope of what Sarah was doing. Master Pembroke had invested heavily in a new strain of cottonseed, purchased at great expense from a dealer in Charleston. It was supposed to be resistant to disease, to produce a higher yield, to be the salvation of Fair Haven's declining fortunes. The entire plantation's future, Pembroke declared over dinner one evening, rested on this crop. He had borrowed money to purchase the seed, had staked everything on this one gamble. The seed was planted in the East Field, the most fertile land on the plantation, with great ceremony and optimism. Pembroke visited the field daily, watching the young plants emerge from the soil, with the pride of a father watching his children grow. He spoke of nothing else, boring everyone at dinner with detailed accounts of the plant's progress and his plans for the fortune he would make. I was walking through the kitchen garden in early October, enjoying the cool morning air and the brief respite from young Thomas's sullen resistance, when I saw Sarah kneeling by the beehives. She kept several hives in the garden, and the honey they produced was used in the kitchen, and occasionally sold for extra income that went, of course, to Master Pembroke rather than to Sarah herself. She was watching the bees again, that same intense focus I had observed before, but this time I saw what she was seeing. The bees were agitated, flying in erratic patterns rather than their usual purposeful straight lines. Some were dying on the ground near the hive entrance, their bodies twitching in the grass. Others were circling the hives but not entering, as if confused or afraid. I approached her without thinking, drawn by curiosity and a growing sense of unease. "Is something wrong with the bees?" I asked. She looked up at me, and it was the first time we had spoken directly. Her eyes were dark and fathomless, and I felt as if I were being measured and found wanting. She held my gaze for a long moment before answering. "They are sick," she said simply, her voice quiet but clear. "The flowers in the East Field have something wrong with them. The bees know they can taste it in the nectar. The East Field where the new cotton was planted, where Pembroke's entire fortune was invested." "Have you told Master Pembroke?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. "I told the overseer," she said, turning back to the bees. "He said I was foolish, that bees are just insects, that I should worry about my cooking and leave the farming to men who understand such things." She said this without bitterness, without anger, simply stating a fact. But I heard beneath her words the weight of a lifetime of not being heard, of not being believed, of being dismissed as ignorant by people who knew nothing. "What do you think is wrong?" I asked. She was silent for a long moment, watching the dying bees. "The seeds," she finally said. "Something is wrong with the seeds. The plants look healthy, but they are sick inside. The bees know. They always know." "You should tell Master Pembroke yourself," I said, though even as I spoke the words, I knew how foolish they were. A slave woman did not simply approach the master with warnings and advice. The social order did not permit it. The very suggestion was absurd. Sarah looked at me again, and this time there was something in her eyes that might have been pity. "He would not listen to me, Mr. Finch," she said quietly. "He does not see me. None of them do. I am invisible." She stood and walked back toward the kitchen, leaving me standing among the dying bees, feeling the weight of her words settle over me like a shroud. 3 weeks later, the entire East Field crop was lost to a fungal infection. The expensive seeds had been contaminated, carrying the disease within them, invisible until it was too late. The plants had looked healthy, had grown strong and green, and then suddenly they had begun to wilt and die, the fungus spreading through the field like wildfire. Master Pembroke's investment was destroyed. His borrowed money was gone. His plans for salvation had turned to ash. he raged. He wept. He struck the overseer across the face with his walking stick and fired him on the spot, blaming him for not detecting the problem sooner, for not taking better care of the crop, for failing in his duties. He drank himself into a stupor and had to be carried to bed by 2 house slaves who struggled under his weight and his incoherent cursing. And through it all, Sarah continued her work in the kitchen, silent and observant, her face showing nothing. I should have spoken then. I should have gone to Master Pembroke and told him what I had seen, what Sarah had predicted, how she had tried to warn him and been ignored. But I did not, because to speak would have been to admit what I was beginning to understand, that this woman, this illiterate slave, who was considered property, who could be bought and sold like a horse or a piece of furniture, was more intelligent than any person I had ever met, that she was waging a war with nothing but her mind, that she was winning. And I was terrified of what that meant, terrified of what it said about the world I had been taught to believe in, about the natural order I had been told was ordained by God himself. If Sarah was human in the fullest sense, music, if she was capable of this level of intelligence and strategy and foresight, then what did that make the system that enslaved her? What did that make the people who benefited from that system? What did that make me? I began to have nightmares. In them, I would see Sarah standing in the fields, and the cotton would wither at her glance. I would see her in the kitchen, and the food would turn to ash in the mouths of those who ate it. I would try to speak to warn someone, to tell what I knew, but no words would come. My mouth would open and close silently, and Sarah would watch me with those dark, knowing eyes. And I would wake gasping, my nightshirt soaked with sweat, my heart pounding like a drum. During the day I went through the motions of teaching. Young Thomas was a poor student, lazy and cruel, taking pleasure in tormenting the house servants and making them fetch and carry for his amusement. I corrected his Latin and taught him about the Roman Empire and said nothing about the empire he was being raised to inherit, the empire built on the backs of people he had been taught to see as less than human. I was a coward. I have always been a coward. The autumn brought more disasters, each one seemingly unconnected to the others. Each one explained away as bad luck or incompetence, or the mysterious workings of fate. A fire in the tobacco barn, started by a lantern that everyone swore had been extinguished, destroyed half the tobacco crop. A broken axle on the cotton wagon caused a week's delay in getting the harvest to market, and by the time it arrived, the prices had fallen. A series of small accidents and miscommunications and inexplicable failures that taken together were bleeding Fair Haven dry. And I began to see that Sarah was not working alone. She could not be. The scope of what was happening was too large, too coordinated, too perfectly timed. She was the center of a web, invisible and intricate, and the other slaves were the strands. They watched and listened and reported back to her. They acted in small ways that compounded into catastrophe. They were a hive like the bees Sarah tended, working together toward a common goal with a coordination that required no words, no written plans, no visible leadership. They were brilliant, they were terrifying, and they were winning. I saw it in small moments, glimpses of a hidden world that existed beneath the surface of plantation life. I saw a fieldsman pause in his work to watch a bird, and I knew he was noting the direction of its flight, gathering information about the weather. I saw a house servant linger in the doorway while the master discussed business, her face blank, but her ears sharp. I saw a child playing in the yard, and I realized she was positioned to see who came and went from the overseer's office. They were everywhere. They saw everything, and they were invisible to everyone but me. and still I said nothing. It was in November that I finally understood the full scope of what Sarah was doing, and it was an act of such subtle genius that I could barely comprehend it. Master Pembroke had one last hope for saving Fair, haven from bankruptcy. He had arranged a marriage for his daughter Elizabeth to the son of a wealthy tobacco planter from North Carolina. The young man, whose name was Richard Ashford, came from a family even wealthier than the Pembrokes had been in their prime. The match would bring a substantial doughy, and more importantly, a business alliance that could save Fair Haven from ruin. The Ashfords came to visit in mid-November, father and son, to finalize the arrangements and allow the young people to become acquainted. A week of entertainments was planned. Everything had to be perfect. The future of the Pembroke family depended on it. I watched Sarah prepare for their arrival with meticulous care. She planned the menus with an attention to detail that bordered on obsessive, consulting with Master Pembroke about the Ashfords' preferences, ensuring that every meal would be a masterpiece. She supervised the cleaning of the house, the preparation of the guest rooms, the arrangement of flowers in every room. She seemed, for the first time since I had known her, to be working in Master Pembroke's interest rather than against it. I began to hope that perhaps I had been wrong. Perhaps the disasters had been coincidence after all. Perhaps Sarah was simply a talented cook and a careful observer, nothing more. Perhaps my imagination had run away with me, seeing patterns where none existed. I was wrong about that, too. The Ashfords arrived on a Monday, and the first dinner was a triumph. The food was exquisite, each course more impressive than the last. The conversation flowed easily. Richard Ashford was handsome and charming, and Elizabeth seemed genuinely pleased with him. Master Pembroke was jovial, expansive, his earlier desperation hidden beneath layers of southern hospitality. I saw hope return to his face, saw him begin to believe that perhaps his luck was finally turning. On Tuesday, Richard and Elizabeth went riding together, chaperoned at a discreet distance by one of the house servants. They were gone for several hours, and when they returned, something had changed. Richard looked pale, uncomfortable. At dinner that evening, he was quiet, withdrawn, responding to questions with monosyllables. His father kept glancing at him with concern, clearly confused by the sudden change in his son's demeanor. On Wednesday morning, the Ashfords announced that they had to leave. Urgent business, the father said. Unexpected developments. They would be in touch. The words were polite, but the meaning was clear. The engagement was off. Master Pembroke was baffled, devastated. What had gone wrong? Everything had been going so well. What could possibly have happened to change the Ashfords' minds? I found out by accident. I was in the library shelving books when I overheard two of the house servants talking in the hallway. They thought they were alone, thought no one could hear them. Their voices were low, but in the quiet of the afternoon, they carried clearly. "Did you see Miss Elizabeth's face when she came back from riding?" one whispered. It was Clara, a young woman who worked as Elizabeth's lady's maid. Sarah told her, the other replied. This was Samuel, an elderly man who served as butler, told her what that boy said about her when he thought no one was listening. Told her exactly. How did Sarah know? She was in the parlor the night before cleaning the fireplace. They didn't see her. They never see us. That boy was talking to his father, saying how Miss Elizabeth was a pretty little fool, how easy it would be to manage her, how her father was desperate and would agree to anything. He laughed about it. Sarah heard every word, and she told Miss Elizabeth every word while she was helping her dress for the ride, just repeated what she heard like she was passing along gossip. But Miss Elizabeth, she's not stupid. She understood what it meant. There was a pause. And then Clara spoke again, her voice filled with something that might have been admiration. "Sarah is dangerous." "Sarah is free," Samuel replied quietly. Even if they don't know it yet, I stood frozen, the book in my hands forgotten. My mind was reeling, trying to process what I had just heard. Sarah had not sabotaged the engagement through any action. She had not poisoned anyone or caused any accident. She had simply told Elizabeth the truth. She had given her the gift of sight, had shown her how her prospective husband really saw her, had armed her with knowledge that allowed her to make a choice. And Elizabeth, who had been raised to be ornamental and obedient, who had been taught that her only value lay in her beauty and her ability to make a good match, had been given the power to refuse. She had seen herself, as Richard Ashford saw her, as a pretty little fool, a means to an end, a transaction rather than a person, and she had chosen differently. It was brilliant, it was devastating, and it was perfectly legal. Sarah had done nothing wrong. She had simply spoken the truth. There was no law against that, no punishment that could be meted out for honesty, but the effect was the same as any sabotage. The engagement was broken. The alliance was lost. Fairhaven slipped closer to ruin, and Sarah had done it with nothing but words. I confronted her the next day. I did not plan to. I had told myself I would stay silent, would continue to observe without interfering, would maintain my careful neutrality. But I found myself in the kitchen, and she was alone, kneading bread, with those precise, powerful hands, and the words came out before I could stop them. "I know what you're doing," I said. My voice shook, betraying my fear and my fascination and my growing horror at my own complicity. She did not look up. Her hands continued their rhythmic work, pressing and folding the dough with a steady, hypnotic motion. "I'm making bread, Mr. Finch. You know what I mean." She continued kneading. The silence stretched between us thick and heavy. Finally, she spoke, her voice quiet and measured. "What am I doing, Mr. Finch?" I opened my mouth to answer, and I found I could not say it, because to say it out loud would be to make it real, to make myself complicit, to force myself to choose between my comfortable silence and the terrible truth I had been witnessing. "You are destroying him," I whispered. She looked at me then, her hands stilling in the dough. Her eyes were not angry. They were not triumphant. They were simply tired, infinitely tired, as if she carried a weight that I could not begin to imagine. "I am surviving," she said. "The same as you. Him music, it's not the same." "No," she agreed, "it is not. You can leave whenever you choose. I cannot. You are paid for your work. I am not. You are free. I am not. So no, Mr. Finch, it is not the same at all." She returned to her kneading, and I stood there, useless and frozen, feeling the truth of her words cut through all my careful rationalizations and self-deceptions. "What will you do?" she asked quietly, not looking at me. "Will you tell them what you suspect?" I should have said yes. I should have said that I would do my duty, that I would report what I had seen, that I would protect the Pembrokes from this invisible threat. But I could not, because I knew with a certainty that terrified me that I would not speak, that I would continue to watch and say nothing, that I would choose my comfortable complicity over the hard demands of truth. "No," I whispered. She nodded as if this confirmed something she had always known. "You are a good man, Mr. Finchmore," she said, and there was no mockery in her voice, only a deep and terrible sadness. "That is why you will say nothing. Good men do not act. They only watch, and they tell themselves that watching is not the same as doing." She returned to her bread, and I left the kitchen, gutted by the truth of her words, knowing that I would carry them with me for the rest of my life. December came, bringing cold rain and early darkness. The plantation was failing. The disasters had accumulated into a crisis that could no longer be denied or explained away. Master Pembroke had begun to drink heavily, his face perpetually red, his hands shaking, his voice rising in anger at the slightest provocation. He shouted at everyone, trusted no one, saw conspiracies and incompetence everywhere he looked. The house was thick with tension, the air heavy with unspoken fears, and still the accidents continued. Small things, each one insignificant on its own, but together they formed a pattern of inexorable decline. A broken lock on the smokehouse that let animals in to spoil the meat. A miscounted inventory that led to a dispute with a merchant and the loss of credit. A letter that went missing, causing a crucial deadline to be missed and a contract to be voided. Fairhaven was dying, and no one could understand why. No one except me, and I said nothing. In mid-December, Master Pembroke made an announcement that sent shock waves through the plantation. He would have to sell some of the slaves to cover his debts. There was no other choice. The bank was demanding payment, and he had no other assets to liquidate. The news spread through the slave quarters like wildfire. I saw the fear in their faces, heard the crying of women who knew their children might be taken from them, saw men standing in silent groups, their faces hard with helpless rage. Families would be separated, children sold away from mothers, husbands from wives. The fragile communities they had built within the brutal confines of slavery would be torn apart. I waited for Sarah to act, to do something to prevent this final horror, but she did nothing. She continued her work as always, silent and observant, her face showing nothing. The slave auction was set for early January. A dealer came from Richmond to assess the merchandise, walking through the quarters with Master Pembroke, examining teeth and muscles, asking questions about health and skills and temperament. I could not bear to watch. I hid in the library pretending to work, while human beings were examined like horses and assigned monetary values, based on their ability to labor. That night I could not sleep. I lay in my comfortable bed, in my comfortable room, and listened to the sounds of grief rising from the slave quarters. Women wailing, men's voices raised in anger and despair, children crying for comfort that could not be given. And I did nothing. I was safe in my room, untouched by the horror unfolding around me, and I did nothing. At 2:00 in the morning, I was startled from my restless half-sleep by shouts and the smell of smoke. I rushed to my window and saw flames coming from Master Pembroke's bedroom on the floor below. The house erupted into chaos. Slaves and family members rushed with buckets of water. The fire was not large, contained to one corner of the room, but the smoke was thick and choking. Master Pembroke was carried out coughing and disoriented, his nightshirt singed, but his body unharmed. It took an hour to extinguish the fire completely, and another hour to air out the house. The damage was not extensive, but it was strange. The fire had started near the fireplace, but not in it. In a place where there should have been no source of ignition, no one could explain it. Master Pembroke was badly shaken. He took to his bed and refused to see anyone for days. The slave sale was postponed indefinitely. He was too unsettled to conduct business, too frightened by his brush with death to focus on anything else. And in that delay, something shifted. A letter arrived from a bank in Richmond. An accounting error had been discovered. Fairhaven was not as deeply in debt as Pembroke had believed. A payment had been credited to the wrong account, and when the mistake was corrected, the financial picture improved significantly. The sale of slaves was not necessary after all. I do not know if Sarah had anything to do with that letter. I do not know if she somehow arranged for the fire, or if it was simply chance, simply one more inexplicable event in a year full of them. But I saw her face when the news was announced to the household. She did not smile. She did not show any emotion at all. She simply nodded once, as if confirming something to herself, and returned to her work. The families were saved. The auction was cancelled, and Master Pembroke, chastened and diminished, began the slow work of rebuilding. The winter passed in a kind of uneasy truce. Master Pembroke was more cautious now, less arrogant, more willing to listen to advice. He consulted with his overseer before making decisions. He paid attention to the weather and the condition of his crops. He even occasionally had music, listened when Sarah made quiet observations about the household or the plantation. He never acknowledged that he was listening to a slave. He never gave her credit for her insights, but he listened, and that was something. Fair Haven survived. Barely, but it survived. And I said nothing. Through it all, through every disaster and every narrow escape, I said nothing. I left Fair Haven in May of 1858. I told the Pembrokes that my mother was ill and needed me in Boston. It was a lie. My mother was perfectly healthy. But I could not stay. I could not continue to live in that house. Keeping that secret. Watching Sarah moved through her days with that terrible, quiet knowledge in her eyes. On my last day, I saw her in the kitchen garden. She was watching the bees again, standing perfectly still in the morning sun, her attention focused on the small creatures moving from flower to flower. I approached her, though I had sworn to myself I would not, though I knew there was nothing I could say that would make any difference. "Why did you do it?" I asked. "Why did you risk everything?" She was silent for a long moment, watching the bees. Then she said, "I did not risk everything, Mr. Finch, because I had nothing to lose. You could have been killed." "I am killed every day," she said quietly. "A little bit at a time. Every day I wake up and I am not free. Every day I work and receive no wages. Every day I'm told I'm property, that I am less than human, that I have no rights that any white person is bound to respect. That is death, Mr. Finch. Slow death. This way, at least I am alive." She turned to look at me, and I saw in her eyes a depth of pain and strength that I could not begin to comprehend. "You saw," she said. "It was not a question." "Yes." "And you said nothing?" "No." Why, I had asked myself that question 1,000 times. I had no answer that did not shame me. "I don't know," I whispered. She nodded as if this confirmed something she had always known. "You are a good man, Mr. Finch," she said again. "But good men who do nothing are not so different from bad men who do evil. The result is the same." She returned to her bees, and I stood there, destroyed by the truth of her words, knowing that she was right, that my silence had been a choice, that my inaction had been an action, that there was no neutral ground in the face of injustice. "I'm sorry," I said, though the words were inadequate, though they could not begin to address the magnitude of my failure. She did not respond. She simply watched her bees, and after a moment I left, walking away from Fair Haven and from Sarah, and from the man I had been, knowing that I could never escape what I had witnessed, what I had understood, what I had chosen not to say. I returned to Boston. I resumed my life. I took a position at a boys' school, teaching Latin and Greek to the sons of merchants and lawyers. I attended lectures and read the newspapers and followed the growing crisis over slavery with an intensity that bordered on obsession. And every night I dreamed of Sarah. I dreamed of her standing in the fields watching the cotton grow. I dreamed of her in the kitchen, her hands moving with that terrible precision. I dreamed of her eyes dark and knowing, looking at me with something that might have been pity or might have been contempt. I should have spoken. That is the thought that haunts me. Not that I should have stopped her, but that I should have spoken. I should have borne witness. I should have said out loud what I saw. That a woman who was considered property, who was denied every human right, who was worked and beaten and sold like an animal, was more brilliant, more strategic, more fully human than any of us who called ourselves her masters. But I did not speak, and my silence was a choice. My silence was a violence all its own. The war came as we all knew it would. The tensions that had been building for decades finally erupted into open conflict. Fort Sumter fell in April of 1861, and the nation tore itself apart. I enlisted immediately, driven by a guilt I could not name and could not escape. I told myself I was fighting for the Union, for freedom, for justice. But I was really fighting to atone for my cowardice. I was fighting to prove to myself that I was not the man who had stood in that kitchen garden and said nothing, while a woman fought for her survival with nothing but her intelligence and her courage. I was assigned to a Massachusetts regiment and sent south back to Virginia, back to the landscape that haunted my dreams. We marched through countryside I recognized, past plantations that might have been fair haven, past fields where slaves still worked under the watchful eyes of overseers, past a world that was dying, but did not yet know it. I fought at Bull Run and was lucky to escape with my life. I fought through the Peninsula Campaign, slogging through swamps and heat that reminded me of my year at Fairhaven. I fought at Antebellum in a cornfield that became a slaughterhouse where men fell like wheat before the scythe. It was at Antietam that my war ended. A mini ball shattered my left leg, the bone splintering into fragments that the surgeon said could not be saved. I was carried from the field on a stretcher, delirious with pain and blood loss. And I remember thinking that this was my punishment, that I was finally paying the price for my silence. They amputated the leg in a field hospital, and I was sent home, invalided out of the war I had hoped would redeem me. I recovered slowly, learning to walk with a crutch, learning to live with the phantom pains that woke me in the night. And when I was well enough, I began to search for Sarah. I wrote letters to Virginia, to anyone who might have information about Fairhaven and its former slaves. I hired agents to search records and interview people. I spent money I could not afford on advertisements in newspapers asking for information about a woman named Sarah who had been a cook on a plantation called Fairhaven. But Fairhaven had been burned during the war, caught in the path of one army or another, and the records were lost. The Pembrokes had fled, scattered to different states, their fortune gone, their world destroyed. The slaves had been freed by Lincoln's proclamation, and they had dispersed, seeking family members sold away years before, seeking new lives in a world that was supposed to be different, but often was not. No one knew what had become of Sarah. No one remembered a cook with a scar on her forehead and eyes that saw everything. She had vanished into history, one more invisible person whose story would never be told. I tell myself that she survived, that she is somewhere free, living the life she fought so brilliantly to preserve. I tell myself that she found family, found community, found some measure of peace after a lifetime of struggle. I tell myself that her intelligence and her courage carried her through the chaos of war and emancipation into a better future. But I do not know. I will never know. And that not knowing is my punishment. More painful than the loss of my leg, more enduring than any physical wound. I am 43 years old now. I teach at the Institute for Colored Youth in Philadelphia, a school for freed men and their children. I try to do good. I try to make amends for my silence. I teach reading and writing and mathematics to students who hunger for education with an intensity that shames the lazy indifference of the white boys I once taught. And sometimes in the faces of my students, I see Sarah. I see that same intelligence, that same fierce determination, that same refusal to be defined by the limitations others try to impose. and I am reminded every day of what I witnessed and what I failed to do. Every day I am haunted by the memory of a woman who waged a war with nothing but her mind, who brought down a plantation with nothing but observation and truth, who survived with a brilliance that shamed everything I thought I knew about the world. I should have spoken. I should have borne witness. I should have said out loud that I saw her, that I understood, that she was not invisible to me. But I did not. And now I am the one who is invisible. I am the one who is haunted. I am the one who cannot escape the weight of knowing and choosing silence. This is my confession. This is my testimony 20 years too late and worth nothing. But it is all I have. I saw Sarah. I saw what she did and I said nothing. May God forgive me. I cannot forgive myself. The students will arrive soon for their morning lessons. Have music. I will teach them their grammar and their arithmetic. I will encourage them and praise their progress. I will try to give them the tools they need to build lives in a world that still does not want to see them as fully human. And I will carry, as I have carried every day since I left Fairhaven, the weight of knowing that I once witnessed true genius, true courage, true humanity in a woman the world had declared to be property, and I said nothing. That is my burden. That is my punishment, and I will carry it to my grave. Historical note: Edward Finch died in 1889 in Philadelphia, where he had taught at the Institute for Colored Youth for over 2 decades. He never married. His colleagues described him as a dedicated teacher, but a haunted man given to long silences and sudden inexplicable bouts of weeping. He walked with a pronounced limp from his war injury, and was known to spend hours sitting alone in the school's garden, staring at nothing. In his will, he left his entire estate to the school, with a note requesting that a scholarship be established in the name of Sarah of Fairhaven, whose brilliance illuminated my darkness and whose courage shamed my cowardice. No record of such a woman has ever been found in the surviving documents from Fairhaven Plantation, which was destroyed by fire in 1863 during the Civil War. Whether Sarah existed, whether she survived the war and emancipation, whether she ever knew that one man had seen her and been forever changed by that seeing, these questions remain unanswered. Edward Finch took his secrets to his grave in Laurel Hill Cemetery, leaving behind only this manuscript, discovered among his papers after his death by the school's headmaster, who preserved it as a testament to one man's struggle with the terrible weight of witnessing injustice and choosing silence. The scholarship he endowed continues to this day, supporting students at what is now Cheney University of Pennsylvania, the oldest historically black institution of higher education in the United States. Every year, a student receives the Sarah of Fairhaven Scholarship, carrying forward the name of a woman whose story was nearly lost to history, whose resistance was invisible to all but one man, and whose legacy lives on in the education of those who came after. The silence of Edward Finch became his prison, a cage built from cowardice and complicity that he carried until his final breath. This story reveals that darkness consumes not only the oppressed, but those who witness oppression and choose inaction. The weight of knowing without speaking can be heavier than any chain. If the complexity of the human soul and the moral weight of witnessing fascinate you, subscribe to the Slab's Revenge for more stories that illuminate the hidden corners of history. What would you have done in Edward's place? Would you have spoken, or would you have carried the weight of knowing into your grave?